I wanted to spend some time talking today about one area that I think is one of the most important parts of the Buddha's teachings, and especially important for people just starting out. It's an area that I feel that most people tend to ignore because it tends to run against our deep-seated habits and tendencies. Now, most of us, we often only like to do the things that confirm what we're doing is right and help us to do it better. So some of us may want to learn meditation because we know that it offers a lot of benefits. It helps reduce stress, it improves focus and awareness, it helps with memory, it helps with decision-making abilities. So these people, they use meditation as a self-improvement tool to help them fulfill their own personal desires. But the problem is, if that's all they're looking for, just using meditation as a tool to help them get ahead in their personal life or in their career, just like going to the gym to work out, to be fitter, or signing up for a public speaking course to better learn how to manage your social relationships, and that's really missing the whole point of meditation. Because we meditate to purify our minds. Pure mind is what leads to true peace and happiness. And a pure mind is free of all afflictive emotions and negative defilements. But often, we try to do one thing to improve our condition, but we don't realize that we do a lot of other things that are impeding us from making progress. As you know, all of us are products of our conditioning. We're conditioned by our past experiences, by habitual thoughts, by our upbringing, by our environment. Now, because of this conditioning, we don't realize that we have all these bad habits that lead to a lot of toxic emotions within us. And when I'm talking about bad habits, what am I referring to? Well, I'm referring to mainly letting our five senses run wild and letting them attach to different sense objects in our environment. Attaching to these sense objects is what leads to all these toxic emotional states that we have in our mind. And so, on the one hand, we might be practicing meditation and self-compassion, but on the other, we're letting all these toxic sense objects get into our consciousness and letting it destroy our well-being. So it's very much like going to the gym every day to exercise because you want good health, but not changing your bad habits of chronic smoking and drinking. So it becomes very difficult for you to make progress in your spiritual practice and to find real lasting peace and happiness in your life if you don't first address the things that are feeding your suffering every day. So we have to learn how to take preventative measures against the things that are feeding our suffering. I talked about self-compassion before, how it involves showing yourself loving kindness and understanding when you're experiencing difficulty. Now, self-compassion is normally more reactionary in nature. It's something you do to ameliorate and cure your suffering once you've experienced it. It's a very helpful technique when it comes to dealing with the physical suffering of sickness, aging, and death, and also the mental sufferings associated with depression, anxiety, low self-esteem. But a lot of the suffering that we experience, especially the mental ones, can be prevented if we know how to protect ourselves against the defilements that erode our happiness and our well-being. So this brings me to my topic for today, which is learning how to guard our senses to live a happier and more peaceful life. Now, what am I talking about when I say guarding your senses? Well, normally our 5 sense doors, our eyes, our ears, our nose, our tongue, and our body, are wide open to the world. We let our 5 senses freely interact with all the different sense objects in our environment. We let our eyes see various sights of nature, sights of our surroundings, images that are being shown on our television, on the internet, in movies. And we also let our ears listen to various sounds, music, speech, the sound of people talking, the sound of traffic. Now, all this sense data that comes in, we should know that it's just raw data, that it doesn't carry any meaning with it on its own. But it's what our thinking consciousness, the mano, it adds and relates and gives it meaning. So how we interpret the data is completely dependent on how we've been conditioned by our past experiences and our habitual thoughts. So in my last talk, I talked about mindfulness and where we should be placing our mindfulness. The fact that we should not be placing it on just the object or on the observer, but really in the space between us and the object. So instead of looking at what we see, we should look at how we see. How are we relating to this object? Are we putting desire and craving in that space? Are we putting ill will and aversion? So the Buddha told us that our conditioned minds are dominated by desire, hatred, and delusion. And so when we let our senses interact with all the different objects in our environment, we're predominantly placing desire, hatred, and delusion in that space between us and the object. So for example, when you see a man or a woman who you find is attractive, you reflect on the pleasantness of how beautiful or handsome that person looks. And in that process, you give rise to feelings of desire and craving. And if we're not conscious of those emotions when they come up, then we let it brew in our mind until it results in a reaction and an action to try to satisfy that craving. So the whole concept of guarding your senses is to withdraw your attention away from the object, to abstain from thinking about it before you get led away unconsciously by the emotions that it carries with it. So we learn not to dwell on the object anymore. We let it go. Because we know that attaching to those objects will lead to all these toxic emotional states in us. And so we let it go. So in many ways, you can think of it as the equivalent of early detection for a disease like cancer. You try to eliminate the problem before it gets to be a serious condition. You try to nip the problem in the bud when it's still treatable. Now, the question that then arises is, how do we go about guarding our senses? What did the Buddha teach us about how to practice sense restraint? Now, if we just rely on our mindfulness alone, then that's not enough, especially since most of us don't have very strong mindfulness to begin with. It's the same as saying, you want to hire a gatekeeper to watch over your home. Well, the gatekeeper will watch and be mindful of who's entering into your home. But if you don't tell that gatekeeper who he should be watching out for, then he won't know who to be keeping out. So if you don't tell him that you should be watching out for robbers and thieves, then he won't know. So you have to give him clear instructions in order to keep your home and keep yourself well protected. Now, another similar analogy would be like saying that mindfulness is like a flashlight that you're holding when you're lost in the forest. Now, if you want to get out of that forest, then you can't just rely on that flashlight alone. It's not enough. What you need is you need a map, you need a compass in order to get you out of that forest safely. And what is that map that we can use to lead us to safety? Well, that map is the Buddha's teachings. And the Buddha told us that if we want to practice guarding our senses, if we want to practice sense restraint, then that first starts with practicing moral discipline, or what we call sila. So sila refers to the moral code or precepts that prevent us from committing unwholesome acts. The Buddha told us that there are 3 essential factors for enlightenment: sila, samadhi, and prajna. Sila is moral discipline. Samadhi is stillness of mind. And prajna is wisdom. Now, some people like to look at these 3 factors as being progressive, one leading to the next. So you first start off with practicing morality, and in turn that will eventually lead you to establish stillness of mind. And when those factors are present, then that's when wisdom will emerge. I think the better way to look at it is to understand that they are really one and of the same. All 3 of them complement each other, and they shouldn't be treated as distinct categories. When you begin to uphold the precepts and abstain from committing all these unwholesome acts arising from body, speech, and mind that lead to defilements, when you lessen those defilements, you begin to establish stillness of mind. But at the same time, when your mind is established in stillness and clarity, you become more mindful and aware of what's happening around you. So you begin to pick up on even all the most subtle and refined actions that lead to your suffering. And so that goes back to further developing your moral discipline. So you can see that all the factors, they reinforce each other, and they should be treated as equally important in your practice. Now, when we're guarding our senses, we're not just talking about sila, but we're really talking about all 3 factors. But what we do is we start with the sila, with the moral discipline. And that refers to taking and upholding the moral precepts as instructed by the Buddha. Now, since we don't have much time today, we only have about 25 minutes, I'd just like to talk about using sila to guard your senses. If we have more time in the future, then maybe I can talk about the other 2 factors. So for lay people, we have the 5 precepts. How many of us here have taken the 5 precepts? So all the people who have the brown sashes. So the 5 precepts, what are they? Abstaining from killing, abstaining from stealing, abstaining from sexual misconduct, abstaining from false speech, and abstaining from taking intoxicants. Now, monks, we have 250 precepts that we have to follow, quite a few more. And By no stretch of the imagination is it easy to follow all 250. And the nuns, well, the going gets tougher for them even more. They have 348. Now, Sila addresses the crudest defilements that we face when we interact with our outside sense objects. It helps us abstain from the actions that cause negative karmic energies that lead to our suffering. Now, the crude defilements, what are they like? Well, they're like the thieves and the robbers that you tell the gatekeeper to keep out. Because if you let them in, then they will rob you and everyone around you from peace and happiness. And what about the refined defilements? What are they like? Well, I like to think of them as the monsters disguised as the mother-in-law. So they're much harder to spot. It takes a lot of mindfulness to be able to see through it. But going back to the crude defilements, we take the precepts and we uphold them in order to prevent the crude defilements from eating away into our happiness and well-being. So the first is abstaining from killing. So this includes abstaining from killing all animals. Animals have the capacity to feel and to experience emotion just as humans do. So we don't take their life to satiate our appetites. And when you come to think of it, the act of killing, it's really a result of this strong attachment to desire, hatred, and ignorance. So we abstain from killing. Now, neither do we steal. That's the second one. Even if it's something as small as taking the pens and paper from your work back home for your kids to use. We don't do that. We don't steal. Stealing comes from the greed and desire to possess the things that you don't have. It doesn't lead to peace of mind. In fact, it leads to destructive states of mind. So we don't steal. Now, the third is abstaining from sexual misconduct. Lay people should abstain from sexual misconduct. Monks and nuns, we have to be celibate. So we completely renounce any sort of that stuff. But we should know that sexual activity that comes from lust and desire for the body and for pleasant feelings. And especially in the case of misconduct, which is having a relationship with someone other than your husband or wife, it causes a lot of suffering for all the parties involved, and it leads to a lot of toxic emotional states in you that eat away at your suffering, eat away at your happiness. So we learn to abstain from it. And the fourth is false speech. Now, false speech is not just lying. It also includes cursing, insincere flattery, double-tongued speech. So that includes gossiping about your coworkers, telling one thing to someone but telling something different to another. All of that is false speech. And the fifth is taking intoxicants. We abstain from it. Drinking and taking drugs, it darkens the mind and it clouds our judgment. So we abstain from it because it can lead to a number of serious consequences, not just with the law, but also with our own moral development. So for the lay people, we have these 5 precepts. Now, before the Buddha entered parinirvana, Ananda, his attendant, asked him who should be their teacher after the Buddha passes away. And the Buddha responded saying that Sila should be their teacher. So clearly, Sila is a very important part of the Buddha's teachings. Even the Buddha said so himself. But why is it also one of the most controversial and one of the least practiced areas within the Buddha's teachings? Almost all of the major historical schisms in Buddhism happened because of disagreements about what precepts should be accepted and followed. It's what led to the division of the Sangha 140 years after the Buddha's passing into the two schools, the Mahasanghika, which eventually evolved into Mahayana Buddhism, and the Sthaviravada, which eventually evolved through many different branches into Theravada Buddhism. Now, there were a number of other schisms that happened in Buddhist history that led to further divisions in the Sangha community and the creation of new schools. But putting all these facts aside, why was there so much disagreement in the Buddhist community about what precepts should be followed and upheld? Well, as I said earlier, most of the things that we do because it confirms that what we're doing is right and helps us to do it better. We have a tendency to selectively choose the things that reinforce what we're doing and help us do it better. So meditation does not really conflict with this. But there's really nothing that challenges this notion more than having to live by a strict moral code that restricts our behavior and tells us that there's certain things that we simply cannot do. Now, the Buddha told us that doing these things will lead us to suffering. But most of us think that precepts and the whole idea of upholding them is far too restrictive and restraining. I can't do this, I can't do that. Isn't that limiting my freedom? If I'm not free, then how can I be happy? And isn't that running against the whole idea of practicing Buddhism to be free and happy? Well, the thing is, we've been padded with so many layers of conditioning from our past experiences and thoughts that we've actually become like prisoners of our own conditioning. So I mentioned in my last lecture that we're not really free at all, in the sense that we don't freely make decisions about the choices that we make. All the choices that we make are just the result of our old conditioned habits. And many of these habits are what actually lead to our suffering. And the habit that the Buddha said is one of the most detrimental to us is letting our senses run wild and not properly guarding them. So the Buddha told us that we should practice morality to start guarding our senses, to stop the crude defilements from robbing us away from our peace and happiness. So it's taking prevention against the things that diminish our well-being and cause us to suffer. So when you come to think of it, that is actually what leads to true freedom, freedom from suffering. But the problem is most people don't see that. Most people don't think that upholding the precepts leads to freedom. They think it leads to restraint. They still want to eat fresh seafood. They still want to have relationships with different partners. When someone insults them, they still want to get back at them by cursing at them, slandering them, and causing all this evil speech. But when you come to think of it, all that is just letting your senses run wild and letting them become slaves to the objects in your environment. So that doesn't lead to true peace and happiness. True peace and happiness comes from first practicing sense restraint. It comes with upholding the precepts and building your mindfulness so that you can abstain from the things that cause you to suffer. So I hope that some of you can start to think more about these things. Notice when you're clinging to objects in the environment, and begin to be aware of some of the toxic emotions that clinging to these objects brings into your mind. And start learning how to guard your senses, to protect your senses from giving rise to all these negative defilements. And when you can do that, then I think you'll start to find some peace and happiness in your life.